everyone, I am here with a true story. This is from the book Angels and Wonders, True Stories of Heaven on Earth. These are all true stories, and all of them mostly come with a quote or a hymn or a Bible verse before the story. And this one is a quote from Bite Your Tongues by Sandra Pratt Martin, and it says, "Seek the giver, never the gift. If you want something from God, then you get alone with him. Talk to him about it." And this story is called When We Ask. And I believe this is one that's pretty long, so, and it's got different stories mixed in, I believe. I like those kind. Yeah, it does. Persistent prayer is part of God's plan for helping us develop a relationship with him. And sometimes we need to pray over a long period of time so God can build up areas of faith within us that are weak and need help. But there are also moments when the response to our prayer is so immediate and so intimate that we are filled with wonder at God's tender touch. 25-year-old Eugenio Mendez was living alone in Seattle, Washington, far from his large family. Grappling with the demands of a new job, he had attempted to date and make friends, but he was shy and socializing was difficult. Gradually, I slipped into a routine of working long hours, coming home and watching a little TV, then falling asleep, he says. Soon, I was deeply depressed. Don't take much, does it? Really don't. For some people, anyways. I know it don't take much for me. One night, Eugenio stared mindlessly at the TV. If only he had a sign, something to give him confidence that his life would not always be so lonely. "God," he said aloud, "I don't think I can take much more. Please help me." Almost immediately, Eugenio heard a soft knock. Surprised, he looked up. In all this time in Seattle, he had only had 1 or 2 visitors. He must be hearing things. The knock sounded again, a bit more insistent. Eugenio opened the door. In front of him stood a small African-American girl holding a flower. Eugenio looked past her, expecting to see an adult, but the hallway was empty. Eugenio looked back at the child. She had compassionate eyes, he noticed, and seemed wise beyond her age. Smiling, she held the flower out. "This is for you," she said, placing it in his hand. Then she turned and skipped down the stairs. Oh, that's why I say all kids know is love. They don't know hate till they're taught hate. Kids are so innocent, and I wish they could stay that way. I really do. If they could, all of us would still be innocent and loving each other. This reminds me of things. I don't want to get into it. There's a lot of people do a lot of bad things. "This is for you." Her words were as sweet as a kiss. In a moment, the yoke of despair had lifted from his shoulders, never to return. A few years later, Eugenio married, and his life is now full and rich. But although he never saw the child again, he will never forget her perfectly timed heavenly message. You are not and will never be alone. Ken called the host and me on the radio station KXLY in Spokane, Washington, about the day he had to pull a tractor across a mountain range. My car's engine needed some work, but I decided to make the trip anyway, he explained. The engine sputtered and slowed, however, and Ken soon realized he needed to replace the spark plugs. You're brave to try to pull out the car. But where? It was dusk, and the highway was deserted. He was creeping along at 10 miles an hour, and at this rate it would take all night to cross the range. God, I did a stupid thing. Please get me out of this, Ken prayed. Up ahead was a small grocery store. Ken pulled onto the shoulder of the road and went inside. The clerk was alone, and she had no spark plugs. We've never sold them, she said, and I don't know where you could get them at this time of night. Not without leaving the road and driving away out of your way. Ken looked out the front window sadly. Now what? Just then a small panel truck pulled up next to his car. The writing on the side of the truck said, what do you think it said, guys? Remember, he asked God for help, and all this distance out there, nobody around, this random little store that didn't even sell spark plugs. What do you think a truck that pulled up beside him said? The truck said, spark plugs. Ken told listeners, not automotive supplies or Ed's service or anything generic, just spark plugs. As if it had been sent specifically for me. It was. God sent him. Ken dashed across the highway. The truck driver had seen the parked car and wondered if anybody was in trouble. Probably thought, why is this boy trying to pull this thing with a car? Yes, he had 4 spark plugs of the proper size in stock. The 2 men replaced the parts, and the driver took the money and drove away. Ken made it across the mountain on time and safe. God can do anything, even out in the middle of nowhere. So often things work out just right, Ken reminded us, and we forget that the credit might belong to someone other than ourselves. That's right, when things happen our way, when we get what we need, and we're not hurting for it anymore, then we forget about God's help. Well, we forgot even asking God for help when it happens. Oh, I got what I wanted now. It's fixed. I don't have nothing to worry about now. You go on your way and forget all about God again. That happens so many times. That's the sad thing. Roland and Mary Tom Hahn had a 200-acre farm in central Kentucky. They are both teachers and raise horses as a second business. One winter evening, Roland was attending a meeting, and Mary had to bring hay to the horses in the field by herself. It had been snowing all day, and she had several inches on the ground. Mary explains, now the wind was whipping it around. Mary loaded the tractor with bales of hay, but for some reason she decided not to dump it in the usual spot near the fence. Instead, she brought it directly to the horses where they were huddling together, in the center of the field. It was a fortunate decision, because as Mary approached the herd, she saw blood on the snow. Apparently a horse had been injured. Which one and how badly? I started spreading hay out for the horses and looking to see which one was hurt, Mary said, but it was getting darker. Finally, she found him, a young stallion. Each time he took a step, blood shot out of a cut on his leg. Oh. Mary tried to catch him, but it was difficult to overtake a horse in an open field, even harder when it is eating and doesn't want to be disturbed. The stallion kept evading her, wandering among the others. Wind whipped Mary's cheeks, and she grew even more concerned. If she didn't catch him, he could bleed to death during the night. After what seemed like a very long time, Mary started to pray. God, she said, I don't want to leave this horse to die, but if I don't get him into the barn, that's what will probably happen. Can you help? The stallion had gone all the way across the field. Suddenly, however, he stopped, turned, looked at Mary, then calmly started to walk back. He strode right through the group of horses, directly toward the barn, as if someone were leading him, not stopping for even a morsel of hay. As Mary watched in disbelief, The stallion entered the barn, then turned and met her eyes as if to say, "Now are you satisfied?" Quickly, Mary closed the barn door and went for help, convinced that God answers even the smallest prayer. That's right. God told the horse, "Go to the barn. She's here to help you." Or he had an angel lead it back, one or the other. God did it. I believe it with all my heart. Okay, next. 13-month-old Seth Beach had been born with a hole between the pumping chambers of his heart. And a recent EKG revealed that it was getting bigger. A catheterization would determine the size of the hole and what to do next. So Seth's worried parents made the arrangements. My father drove to the hospital the night before the procedure to visit us, Seth's mother Phyllis recalls. As he pulls into the hospital parking lot, a man in a car one space away called to Dad, asking if he had any water for his engine. Dad did, and as he poured it into the car, the man mentioned that he was visiting his wife. Phyllis's father spoke of his baby grandson and the family's concern. "Are you a praying man?" the stranger asked. "I certainly am," Phyllis's father answered. "Well then," the man replied, "when I get home, I am going to get on my knees and pray for your grandson. Expect a miracle." Phyllis's father turned to put the water on the floor of his car's back seat. Expect a miracle. It was an unusual thing for a stranger to say. He looked up. The man in his car had vanished, even though the only way out of the lot was past him, and no vehicle had gone by. He was still pondering the mystery when he arrived in Seth's room. "I think I've just met an angel," he told his daughter. Phyllis thought Seth could use all the extra prayers possible, whether from angels or ordinary mortals. But it was not until the following day that she realized the power of the stranger's promise, for Seth's physician could find no trace of the hole. Then there only a narrowed valve, which had given this healthy child no trouble ever since. The hole was gone in the valve. He ain't had a problem with it since that day. So he's completely cured. 10-year-old Christy and her sisters were returning from visiting a relative, riding in the open back of their stepfather's pickup truck. I loved doing that when we was kids. We always loved riding in the back of a truck. You get in trouble for it now. Pretty dangerous too. You think about it nowadays. Christy was afraid of her stepfather. Yep. He had a terrible temper, and she never knew what was going to make him mad. The truck bumped along the rutted Royal Road. Christy was holding her new red jacket when a sudden gust of wind blew across the truck. Her jacket flew out of her hands. "Oh no," she cried, watching it rise into the air. Her stepfather pulled the truck over. "Did something just blow out of the truck?" he asked angrily. I know this kind of person all too well. All too well. I don't even like reading about it. No one spoke. Christy's heart began to pound. I can feel her fear. She had seen her jacket fly into the fields and disappear. It was gone forever. Her stepfather seemed to already know. "You had better have your jacket with you when we get home," he said to her, and pulled onto the road again. Christy and her sisters looked around the open truck just in case, but there was nothing to see. Christy began to cry. She was in trouble, and she would be punished. "Please, God, please," she murmured. She didn't know if that was the right way to pray, but it was all she could do. When the truck pulled up in front of the house, her stepfather got out and came around to the tailgate. "Christy, where is your jacket?" he said. He's just looking for a reason to hurt her. Trust me, that's all he's wanting. He can't wait. Cannot wait. Christy opened her mouth to tell him the truth. Just then, her sister grabbed her arm. "Look," she pointed. Lying in the middle of the truck floor in plain sight was the red jacket. God put it there. He saved her from getting a beating, possibly him hurting her very badly. Next. "What goes around comes around," Roberta said, a farm wife living outside Miller, South Dakota. Certainly knows this to be true. She had taken a quick trip into Miller one morning and was rushing home to get the noon meal on the table for the men. As she drove, she was also keeping an eye out for her father, who lived alone and had emphysema. That's horrible. My grandpa had that. He died. He didn't drive much except for the 12 miles out to our farm, she says. So I always knew that it was he needed help on the road, someone would stop. But it was still a worry for her, and she often prayed for his safety. There was no sign of Roberta's father's car. Instead, up ahead, she saw another vehicle stopped at the side of the road, a man peering into the engine. I was in a hurry, and although I always help people, I know this man was a stranger, Roberta said. She could have kept going, but something told her to stop, and she did. The driver was having trouble with his battery, so Roberta drove to a neighboring farm, borrowed booster cables, drove back, and got the car going. "This is wonderful," the driver thanked her and reached for his wallet. "Could I—" "No payment necessary," Roberta smiled, getting back in her car. "Just return this favor by helping the next person you find stalled along the road." "I certainly will." The man waved as she pulled out. 2 weeks later, Roberta's father phoned with an interesting story to tell. "I went to an auction about 50 miles southwest of here," he began. 50 miles! Roberta was aghast. "Dad, you never drive that far alone." "And I got a flat tire on the way home." By now, Roberta was in a panic. The area what he was describing was a back country road with little or no chance of anyone coming by. Nor could her father have changed his own tire, weakened as he was. "What happened?" she asked. You wouldn't believe it. A nice motorist came along right away and changed my tire. But when I offered to pay him, he said no. Seems a woman outside of Miller had given him a battery jump 2 weeks ago and told him to pass on the favor. That was his very daughter. He was paying the debt to her. Roberta felt love surrounding her like a hug. I think God knew Dad was going to do that, and so he arranged a rescue ahead of time. She says, "I look for evidence of his presence all the time, and I always find it." Next. Margaret had Margaret had sung soprano in her church choir. I was soprano as well, since she was a young girl. My favorites were the traditional hymns like Blessed Assurance and Fairest Lord Jesus, she says. When I sang, all my feelings seemed to pour out. It was my absolutely favorite thing to do. I love to sing too, but it's hard for me to do it with my lungs anymore. Margaret and her family eventually moved and joined a church where these songs were rarely sung. She had intended to sing in the choir anyway, but over the next several months she noticed her once crystal voice turning gravely and hoarse. Lozenges and sprays had no effect. I could no longer hit the high notes, she explains. It was a painful thing to face, but my singing days were apparently over. Margaret had become friends with a woman, Myrtle, who eventually developed cancer. Margaret visited her friend regularly in the hospital. Even after Myrtle fell into a coma, on Myrtle's birthday, Margaret slipped into the room and gazed at her unconscious friend. Myrtle was hooked up to tubes now, and Margaret sensed her life going away. If only they could communicate. She put her hand on Myrtle's arm. God, she prayed, help me to help her. Unbidden, the comforting words to God will take care of you came to Margaret's mind. She hadn't sung that song in years. She didn't remember all the lyrics anymore, and her voice was so terrible now. But if Myrtle could hear her, perhaps the words would bring comfort. Bending over the bed, Margaret began to sing. Quietly at first, then with growing confidence began in astonishment. She heard her own voice as high and sweet as it had been long ago. How could this be? Margaret didn't know, but still singing, she sat down next to Myrtle and took her hand. Then she began another favorite. What a friend we have in Jesus. That's a good one. What a friend we have in Jesus. She was remembering all the verses. She realized with no hesitation or groping. Her heart lifted with joy. She kept singing. All afternoon, with only one woman as her audience, Margaret gave a very special concert. At least 40, of her favorite hymns, with all the words and all the verses came to her mind, and she sang every one. And her voice, it was as clear as crystal, true and lovelier than ever before. A stranger glancing into the room might have seen a patient, unresponsive and asleep, but Margaret sensed that she was making contact, that somehow Myrtle knew she was not alone, that a friend had brought her a special gift for her final birthday. She knows, she knows. Margaret was still singing several hours later when one of Myrtle's bedside machines buzzed. Myrtle took one breath, then relaxed. Nurses came running, but there was nothing to be done. Margaret left the hospital in sorrow, yet strangely exalted as well. I felt as if I had experienced some connection with heaven, she says, and there was also the wonder of her vocal recovery to ponder. She heard you. Trust me, she did. But when Margaret attempted to sing at home, she realized that her voice had returned to its former hoarse state. Nor could she remember the titles, much less the lyrics of even a few of the songs she had sung so effortlessly on this blessed day. Eventually, Margaret went to a specialist and discovered that she had Sjögren's syndrome, an immune system disorder that takes moisture out of the body, rendering eyes and mouth dry and throat hoarse and gravely. There were treatments Margaret could take, but no cure. Nor did the condition spontaneously improve. There was no way Margaret's voice could have did that this past perfection. Not even temporarily. No way at all. I know a way. Unless the heavenly hosts were busy that day, that's right, and pressed an earthly angel into service to send a soul into paradise on wings of songs. That's right, she got to spend special time with her special friend before she died, and her special friend sung her into heaven. God gave them their special moment together before she went on to paradise. And they both have a great memory. God did that, and I truly believe it. Don't you guys? A lot of people won't believe nothing until they experience it for themselves, but I've experienced a lot of miracles. And when I hear stuff like this and read stuff like this, I truly believe this stuff happened to these people, because I've experienced stuff myself. And most people don't believe me. That's why I don't talk about it anymore. But I know it's true. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your night, and I hope you enjoyed these stories. Good night, guys.